Hello, this is a motion debrief on the motion. This House believes the general approach of states should be to repatriate refugees once they no longer have a well-founded fear of persecution or violence. So this is going to go over what I think government teams can run and what opposition teams can run. As a caveat, this is not an exhaustive list of arguments you can run or mechanisms you can run as well. So take it as a general guideline rather than like the word of God as to what you can do on this motion. So from side government, the first thing you need to do is you need to set up this debate. I think there are three key pieces of setup. The first is just to give a general definition of what refugee means. And I think the reasonable kind of one is to say you are a refugee if you're persecuted on the basis of your identity, whether that is political leanings, ethnicity, sexuality, or gender. The second thing then is when does this policy kick in the first place? You don't need to be exhausted here either, but I can just give a few examples so it is concrete in the minds of the adjudicator and other teams is necessary for a clean debate. So, for example, the end of a conflict, the passing of a law, such as now a law allowing gay marriage, and thirdly, the change of government. I think a recent example here is the deposition of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh means that wings of the BNP are prosecuted far less than compared to when the Awami League was in power. The third thing then is just to give, because this is a policy motion and you do have to anticipate, just give some clarification as to what the repatriation process is likely to look like as well. And that looks like a few things. I'd say that firstly, you get a decent notice of when this happens, like 6 months to a year. And then secondly, the state would facilitate your movement back to your home country. So for example, that includes the movement of your possessions, the purchase of plane tickets, and to facilitate accommodation in your home country as well. So then, what arguments can you run on side government? And the first thing to note is that for side government, there is a defensive principle that you probably have to run at some point in the debate, and that principle is the state has a right to do this. The reason as to why it is a defensive principle and not one which will win your debate is for the reason that even if a state has a right to do this, it does not explain why this is a good policy or a bad policy by any means. And for example, the state has a right to implement many laws, but some of those laws we would say are obviously bad. So for example, like abandoning gay marriage, I think most people would suggest is quite a bad thing. States probably have a right as a lawmaker, but it's not something you would want them to do. So when you run a defensive principle, there are two things to consider, because if you lose this principle and OP are able to prove the state does not have a right to do this, OP is able to win on that basis. And that is why you need to defend against it. So two things. Firstly, you can do it quick and dirty in setup. So quickly explain why a state has a right to do this and then go, I hope this is not contentious and that teams do not litigate this, and move on from there. Or secondly, you can run it in response to a potential opposition principle, which says states do not have the right to do this. When you run this principle, you have two things to consider. The first is just to explain that the states actually have a right to do this. And you can explain this relatively simply by talking about sovereignty, and that states do often have a right when it comes to controlling the inflow and outflow of people. And that you can run an analogy essentially to things like migration controls. The second then is to say that states have discharged their obligation to refugees, which is to say they've already provided refugees with a series of benefits like healthcare, education, housing, and more importantly, the precondition as to why refugees can access these benefits no longer exists in a world where they are not being persecuted, and that suggests states have discharged their obligation. Principle done. Then we'll think about more substantive arguments you can run. So I think there's a few substantive arguments you can run. The first one I'm going to talk about is that this is better for other refugees. And the one premise you need to explain in this debate is just to say that you can take in more refugees when this policy exists. And the thing you need to prove here is to prove why there is a current constraint on the number of refugees you take in. So there's a few things you can talk about here, which is to say you can explain there is limited political will to take in more refugees. There are also resource constraints. So for example, direct resource constraints like the lack of housing for refugees, or also indirect resource constraints, things like the state purse, which is say the money which goes into healthcare and welfare systems. And you can impact this argument by just explaining you get more refugees. These refugees are more important because they're actually under threat of persecution and are therefore more vulnerable. There are two pieces of preemption you probably have to deal with in this argument. The first is that you need to preempt that the common argument that migrants are helpful for the economy. And the way you can do that is twofold. First, it's saying these refugees are probably not helpful to the economy because they're not being selected, which say many kind of migration controls always select for skilled labor as opposed to unskilled labor. And the second thing you can explain is that if you're a refugee, you're often likely to be disadvantaged because you've been denied an education on the basis of, say, your gender, or you're not allowed to participate in labor markets because of an affiliation with a particular political group, etc. So these people might not have the skills to actually help these countries. The second thing you need to preempt is you need to preempt the idea that, well, these refugees have started a life already, so, unfair to displace them. And there's a piece of mitigation you can use here, which won't delete the whole argument, but can help a lot in at least winning back a little bit of the argument, which is to say naturalization laws exist in most countries, and that applies to refugees. So, for example, if you are a refugee in Australia and have resided in the country for 4 years, you can apply for citizenship. So for long-term refugees who've already been here, it is very unlikely they're going to be displaced by this policy. All right, the second argument then you want to explain is why you want to explain it is good for refugees. So there are two premises in this argument. The first is you want to explain why many want to move back to their home countries, but are actually unable to do so. And a simple reason is often just monies and savings needed to move back is a significant cost, and as a result, they can't leave. The second premise then is explain why these countries are often bad for refugees, and that just looks like kind of a series of reasons, such as racism, exploitation in work because they can't speak the language and don't know about their labor rights. A time away from family is particularly draining, and also poor domestic protection, such as lack of access to voting rights or healthcare. And these are the reasons as to why a refugee's experience in the new country is often quite awful and not particularly desirable, and why they often do want to move back. So for everyone who wants to move back, now you have a state policy which facilitates and allows them to move back to their home country, and that is a benefit. The very obvious preemptive here then is, what if there are people who want to stay? Aren't you forcing them to move back? So there are two ways in which you can deal with this and mitigate this argument, because I think it's not an argument you can delete by any means. So all you can do is mitigate in a way. The first is explain why this is likely to be a minority of people. The reasons stated above about why countries are quite awful and bad for refugees would stand in place in explaining why probably very few people want to stay. But the second thing then is explain why you're willing to trade them off. And there are two ways in which you can do this. The first is that you can say other refugees are more vulnerable because there's an immediate threat of harm. But secondly, often if you have an established life here already, there is a very easy opportunity for you to return on a working visa. And it's particularly true if you have existing employment and get sponsorship, etc. So these two reasons suggest that maybe it's okay to trade off these people. So this is actually probably the central trade-off government needs to win in this debate, and it can be tricky to do so. So I think in prep time at least, you need to be conscious of this and be conscious of brainstorming some ways to win this clash, or otherwise you might be left in a pretty sticky position. The third substantive argument you can run here is that it allows for more refugees at any given time. And whilst this argument might sound similar to the first argument on why it is better for refugees because you can take in more refugees, you should explain why it is analytically distinct. And note, being able to explain why things are analytically distinct is a particularly useful skill at closing, which allows you to run arguments which might be a bit similar, but are ultimately sufficiently different and can be credited as a winning extension. So this argument then is different from the first argument, because the first argument is about cycling through refugees so that over a long period of time, you might have more refugees. This argument, however, is that you get more refugees at any given time. So for example, argument 1 says you can get 50 refugees at 3-year intervals. This argument says, no, now we get 100 refugees at any point in time, and then you multiply that by your 3-year intervals, essentially. So it is somewhat analytically distinct. And the way you can prove this is similarly in this proving why you get more political capital to take them in. And there are kind of two key ideas here. The first is that people believe that you are a legitimate refugee because currently in the status quo, there are many people who just think that a refugee stays in the country because they want to take advantage of the resources in this country and they're not under any real forms of persecution. Therefore, they don't deserve to be here. But if you had a policy which sent home everyone who now no longer had a well-founded fear of persecution, it suggests that any refugee in the country has to be a legitimate refugee who, if they went back to the country, is likely to be persecuted and harmed in a meaningful way, which therefore means you're likely to see the refugee population at any given time as being legitimate. The second thing here is the economic drain is no longer as large because it is, once again, more temporary. And there is two impacts of this. The first, you get more refugees, but the second is that you also get a better treatment of refugees because people are more, view them as being more legitimate. So That's another argument you can run here, and probably an argument you can consider in extension, because it is, I think, maybe not the immediately obvious one compared to the first one on cycling through refugees. The last argument I kind of have here brainstorm is this idea that this is good for the state that they are returned to. So the home country is better off under this policy. And the premise you need to prove here is to say, why are they even needed in the first place? And the few reasons here is to say that one, often brain drain exists to quite a large extent. And this is an explanation that people who are able to leave as refugees are often more privileged than those who are unable to leave, because they're able to access black markets, they're able to pay a human smuggler, they're able to pay a plane ticket out of the country. And that tracks with being, a skilled worker, someone who's got more money, someone who's worked in a place where they can get employment. A caveat here is that this is a tension of early analysis about not being helpful for the economy. So that obviously means if you want to run this, you shouldn't run the other piece of analysis. I think both can be true, but you should make a strategic decision and be careful you don't get caught in a bind. But secondly, if you wanted to break the tension, I think you can try to explain that, well, often they have skills, but it's not recognized by the labor market because of racism. And as a result, there are issues there as to whether they actually have the practical skills to be able to, help a country, etc. So I think that that's the first mechanism you can run here. Other mechanisms can also just look like these countries just came out of conflicts and need more people for the rebuilding effort. And also for the fact that often these people who have lived in some time in a different country have more cash and money, and based on just having better purchasing power, meaning they can go back and spend and fund local economies. And the impact here is that it is better off for these countries on a whole as well. So that's kind of the broad arguments you can run on the government of this debate. And as you can see here, I think there's around 4 arguments. 4 arguments are usually sufficient to have some room for closing as well, given that vertical depth also exists on most of the claims being made in this debate. So turning now to side opposition, what arguments can you run? The first piece of advice I give you here is just to say that often when thinking about opposition arguments, I think about, can I flip every single argument run on side government and make an argument for side opposition? So, for example, can I flip arguments on why it's bad for why it's good for the new country, why it's good for the home country, why it's good for refugee intake, and flip it and explain why it actually harms all of those kind of outcomes which government wants to look for? And if that is true, then presumably you've already got 4 arguments right off the bat, which you can run in this debate. And that's particularly important if you're on side closing government, closing opposition, which is to say, if you don't really have an extension, not sure what to run, just listen to what the other team runs. If you can flip it, that's a new substantive argument, which can be useful for winning the debate if it isn't run by the opening. So what arguments can you run there? And the first very simple argument you run off is that it is bad for people who are forced to leave. So there are 2 premises to the argument. The first is to say people who would want to go back to their home country can already go back to their home country. That therefore means that if you have not returned to your home country after the end of persecution, it means you want to stay and it's harmful to displace you. So premise number 1, why can people return? The first is that often money earned in the West is worth far more than money which you earn in your home country, which is why when you go back to your home country, you have far more purchasing power. There's also cheap real estate. That often means you're able to start a better life than you had initially when you return back to your home country. Then onto the second premise as to why people would not necessarily want to return to their home country. And it's just like, people build a new life in the country. It's particularly disruptive. They often have a job, kids might go to school, they have new social networks, or very simply, the home country is often worse. There is often a strong correlation between persecution, countries with lots of persecution, and also high rates of poverty, destitution, and crime. And also just very, very simply, that even if you return to your home country, discrimination still often exists. So for example, even if same-sex marriage is legalized, you can still be discriminated against. And a very simple intuition to run here is to say, in developed countries where ostensibly they've got better rights protection than developing countries in the world, hate crime still exists. And that kind of discrimination still exists even in the most progressive of countries. So that is why it is bad for those people to return to their home countries. And you impact it in that way to say it's principally unfair, but also being deported is quite distressing and it's also particularly disruptive to the life they've built up. The second argument you can run is why you can explain that it's bad for the country which the refugees went to, so the new country. And there's 2 ways to explain this. The first is that you can explain that migration is good, particularly industries in many countries rely heavily on migrant and refugee labor, things like textiles and aged care. And maybe these people are like, these aren't great industries to work at because they involve high amounts of manual labor, The reality is, in any country, someone needs to do this, and you'd much rather a refugee get paid, say, an Australian minimum wage and compared to a Bangladeshi minimum wage in a sweatshop. So that is why they feel a particular need in the labour market, and it's good for these countries. The two pieces of preemption to make this argument work fully is, firstly, you need to explain why can't you use regular migrant workers. The first is that you select for skilled workers already, rather than those who have less skills. And then also, secondly, there are often pushback from migrant workers who choose to settle in cities as opposed to rural towns, which often refugees do not have control over and get settled by the government, or where there is a place to settle them, essentially. The second preemptive is, well, won't these refugees just get exploited here in the new country as well? And I think the simple thing to say is be comparative. Often in a developed country, at least there's still better work health and safety regulations than that in a developing countries where regulations are far more weak. So that's the first kind of argument about the labour market. Second thing here is that it is bad for areas where refugees get resettled. So often refugees don't get resettled in city centres where there isn't enough space to build more housing or whatnot. Instead, they often get settled to rural areas or areas a bit more further away from the city. And it is particularly important that refugees stay here because people start building a business around them and they're able to kind of revitalize towns which have experienced high amounts of rural and urban migration. So when people leave these areas, it is bad for businesses who set up into areas who seek to provide for these people. Also, that the churn in of itself is kind of a harm because when you have to go through the process of retraining workers, etc., it creates a bunch of uncertainty, it creates more costs on businesses, and that is a bad thing as well. So two kind of general ways as to why this policy could be bad for a new country. Then there are other arguments you can make here, is to say it is bad for the home country. And the way to explain this argument is that you have a bunch of people who are going back to a country which just experienced lots of tensions and now have a very small moment of fragile peace. And putting a bunch of people who were initially people who either stoked the tensions or a source of the tensions back into the country is likely to be something which upsets the kind of stability and can result in more kind of civil unrest, in worst case scenario, a relapse into the country. And that is something which is particularly bad. If there's a characterization adopted early in this is a bunch of disprivileged people, then you can frame it, it's a lot of people who are disprivileged minorities who are now looking for jobs and explain the potential harms which can exist when it comes to interacting with people who might still have particularly pernicious social norms towards these individuals, and that creates a bunch of social unrest and instability. So that's the kind of sort of argument you can run by saying it's bad for the home country. Next, you can say this is also bad for refugee intake, and the way you explain this argument is to say, well, every time you cycle through a set of refugees based on like they come in, then said conflict ends now, and now they have to leave, and the new batch of refugees comes in. At each point, there is a new political battleground where people have to discuss, do we take in more refugees or less refugees? And at each point is a new opportunity to talk about crime problems, etc. And that could result in less refugees being taken overall as well. The last argument we have on side opposition is also an argument to say that this policy actually results in these minority groups in their home country getting continually persecuted. And the reason is that this provides an incentive for kind of governments in control to not pass a law which helps these minorities, because they know that if they pass this law, then these minorities will get put back into the country, and that is something they do not want. Which therefore means the best way actually to keep out a group of people they do not want is to continue oppressing them and to ensure that they can't come back and to create conditions so bad they have to leave the country. So, and that obviously is worse for anyone who has to stay in the country and lacks the ability to leave the country, and that's a harm. And the second thing here is that often these minorities in the home country are now less likely to get diaspora support, because people who are able to leave the home country know that they're going to get deported once a new law is being passed. And often the support they get from these individuals are quite important. It looks like things like remittances, it looks like connections to foreign aid groups, and it also looks like this kind of soft skills you learn when it comes to organizing social movements, etc. So they're far less likely to get that sort of support. And the impact then is that that with this policy, you're far more likely to not get any change which is desirable and helps more people in the country than otherwise. So that's kind of 5 arguments you can run on side opposition. So anyhow, hope this was helpful. That's the end of my debrief.